chapter 31, section 3. Some are going to begin to question the effectiveness of nonviolence. And you're going to see the emergence of militants. And a prime example of a militant group in the civil rights era is the Nation of Islam, also known as the Black Muslims. The Nation of Islam was founded by Wallace D. Fard. We do not know much about this guy except for Detroit, Michigan, 1930, he begins this Nation of Islam. It's going to be based on the Islamic religion that had been founded by Muhammad. And the Black Muslims are going to emphasize the supremacy of blacks. As you get into the 1930s, the leader of the Nation of Islam is going to be Elijah Muhammad. What happened to Wallace D. Fard? Nobody's really sure. He was going from Detroit to Chicago. He disappeared. It's thought that Elijah Muhammad might have had something to do with that. In the 1930s, the Nation of Islam is going to have about 8,000 members. And he is going to preach this idea of black nationalism, which called for the creation of a black republic in the U.S. And one of the things he is going to call for is a lot of African Americans are going to get rid of their last name. Their last name was considered to be a relic of slavery. It was usually the slave owner's last name. And so since they don't know what their real last name should be, they're going to replace it with an X. Elijah Muhammad is going to stress self-discipline, which to him meant no alcohol or tobacco. It also meant a strict diet needed to be followed. And he also called for self-reliance. Now remember, this is the 30s. It's in the midst of the Great Depression. So that meant taking no help from the government during the Depression. Black Muslims were discouraged from serving in the military. Many of them will actually go to prison during World War II because their draft numbers came up and they refused to go. So they go to prison for draft evasion. And Muhammad at this time realizes a lot of African American prisoners were being ignored by a lot of the other organizations. So he starts recruiting these convicts. He starts recruiting more in the lower income African American groups. And by the time you get to the 70s, the number of black Muslims is going to number around 100,000. A lot of that growth was going to happen in the 1950s due to Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a young minister. His original name was Malcolm Little. And he is going to argue that the time for nonviolence was over. And he called for freedom by any means necessary. This message frightened many Americans. This any means necessary. Very opposite of Martin Luther King Jr.'s message. They only met once. Malcolm X was a critic of King's. Said he's taken away a black man's right to defend himself. In the mid-60s, Malcolm X is going to begin to go through a transformation. In 1964, he's going to go on a pilgrimage to the Islamic holy city of Mecca. Good Islams are encouraged. One of the pillars of Islam is that they are to go to Mecca on a pilgrimage in their life, if able. 1964, he goes on this. When he goes to Mecca, he's going to begin to hear traditional Islamic beliefs. And he begins to understand the universal humanity of all races, Islam did not preach one race over another. Malcolm X is going to break away from the black Muslims, the Nation of Islam. But he's going to have very little time to promote his new ideas, because in February of 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated by 3 black Muslim assassins. Now, most whites saw the civil rights movement as this one unified effort. In actuality, there were a lot of different groups. They had one goal in the end, but they didn't always agree on how to get there. And you started to see conflicts start to surface. Some activists were tired of being beaten and arrested all the time. Some start questioning whether they even want integration. Some become very frustrated. Like the white volunteers during Freedom Summer. Some thought the whites are trying to take over our own civil rights movement. You start seeing more of an interest in that idea of black nationalism. Some are angry that when whites are killed during this, it draws huge attention. But when blacks are killed, nobody seems to care. The split in the civil rights movement becomes public in 1966. James Meredith decides to host a protest march across Mississippi. He's going to march across Mississippi. On the second day of his march, he is shot and wounded. Can't continue the march. Several organizations vow to continue his journey. Which brings us to Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael is actually going to convince some of the more conservative movements or groups to leave. He wanted to turn this march into an event for black nationalism, and Carmichael begins using the slogan, Black Power. Martin Luther King Jr. actually asks him to stop using that slogan. King raises a great point. He says, if you really have power, you don't need a slogan to tell people you have power. This Black Power movement wanted black separatism, encouraging racial pride and interest in African culture. There were many African Americans that were attracted to Carmichael's Black Power message, including Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. In California, they're going to create the Black Panther Party. The Black Panthers are going to call for necessities for African Americans. Things as simple as land and bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace. They also called for black self-defense groups to defend themselves from the racist police, especially in Los Angeles, California. And they often appeared in public carrying firearms, very heavily armed, which in California at this time was completely legal. But what it did was it resulted in numerous gun battles with police. There's going to be other oppositions to King. King's going to want to expand the struggle to injustices in housing, in economics, things like that. By 66, really, King's group, the SCLC, was the only one still focused on nonviolence. And King is going to decide to battle housing discrimination in Chicago. And he's going to move his family to the slums of Chicago. July 10th, 1966, King's going to announce how determined he was in Chicago. And he's going to organize, later in July, a protest march, a peaceful march. But during this march, King is struck in the head by a rock somebody throws. And there were about 4,000 whites threatening the marchers. The only reason the marchers escaped without any more harm was because of the city police protection. King announces that they're going to hold another march in Cicero. Cicero is known for its violence. And the city of Chicago does not want to see this march happen. They know how it's going to end. And so they announce that they're going to meet King's demands. And although King claims this is a victory, he's a little drawn back at how much resistance there was in the North. There wasn't the white support as much as he had hoped. By the time you get to the mid-60s, you're going to see a lot of reluctance to support civil rights movement any farther. You know, Johnson didn't push for much more anymore. The Black Power movement was turning people away. Riots in some of these cities was turning people away. You know, discrimination, though, was still affecting people. August 1960, you're going to have violence break out in a Los Angeles neighborhood. It was triggered by a routine arrest, a completely legal arrest in a black neighborhood. And a riot gets triggered that's going to last for 6 days. The National Guard has to be called in to put it down. 34 people killed, hundreds injured, 4,000 arrests are made. Over the next 2 years, there are going to be over 100 riots in the U.S. The worst one occurring in Detroit, where 43 people die. Johnson wants to investigate this violence, and he appoints the Kerner Commission to look into why this is all happening. And they charge that white racism was responsible for the tension. King is going to support the idea that African Americans need to gain economic power. And he's a little upset because so much money in the 60s is starting to be funneled towards the war in Vietnam. King is going to call for the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign is going to be a march on Washington, D.C. to protest government spending. Here we are funneling millions and millions of dollars to this fight in Vietnam, and yet we have all of these issues here that should be dealt with. On his way to the Poor People's Campaign in D.C., King is going to stop in Memphis, Tennessee. There was a strike going on in Memphis, Tennessee, and King wanted to lend his support to the strike that was occurring there. And on April 4th, 1968, a sniper is going to shoot and kill Martin Luther King Jr. on his balcony of his hotel. King is dead. And the guy that they're going to end up arresting for it was James Earl Ray. There are conspiracy theories surrounding this. There are ideas that maybe Ray didn't do it. Even King's wife eventually starts supporting the idea that she don't think James Earl Ray was responsible. The civil rights movement carries on after King's assassination, but it never really gained the steam that it once had.